Thank you for joining us for the Lifelong Learning at Home series presented by the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning. For over 20 years, the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning has been offering unique adult learning opportunities on Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses. Our non-credit courses are intended for personal interest and self-education. We're pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn from your own home and are excited to be joined today by Wayne Morris. Wayne Morris worked his way through the ranks in Correctional Services in both Alberta and Ontario, finally becoming the Superintendent and managing a number of the facilities that he will be discussing in his lecture today. Wayne also worked in other capacities in corrections and has been in the academic community since 2003. He's been teaching a number of criminology courses at Wilfrid Laurier University since 2012. Thank you for joining us today, Wayne. We'll now turn it over to you for your lecture, What's It Like in Jail in Ontario?
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Yes, today's lecture is going to be about what it's like in jail in Ontario. And as Jen mentioned, I am a faculty member teaching part-time in the criminology department at Wilfrid Laurier University. So we're going to talk about what it's kind of an overview of jails and detention centers and prisons in Ontario and Canada, and I'm going to spend some special time concentrating on those within the Waterloo Region or servicing the Waterloo Region. We're going to talk about what it's like inside. I'll show you a few pictures, and then I'm going to talk about problems that are faced by people who are managing those facilities. So as said in the introduction, I was in the correctional system for 30 years. A majority of the time was actually in correctional facilities, both in Alberta and within Ontario. I was one of those people who went out to Alberta during the boom times and then came back when promotional opportunities became available in Ontario. I think it's important to understand a little bit of background as far as who does what. People who are sentenced to jail, prison, and receive a shorter sentences of 2 years and under are a provincial responsibility. So and people around here would end up going into a provincial correctional institution where they're serving a sentence of 2 years less 1 day. 2 years plus a day or 2 years flat are federal responsibility, and people would go to a prison. In addition, people who are held awaiting trial, they're remanded in custody, they're held by the province or territory. And they could be held in a jail or a detention center. They're just basically the same thing, except the jails are the older facilities and are much smaller. Detention centers are much larger and are more recent. Prisons, when you use that term, usually refers to a federal institution. And in Ontario, most of those federal institutions are in the Kingston area. Give you an idea of some jails around here. This is the Brantford jail, which is about 1.5 blocks, 2 blocks north of the place where Laurier is functioning in Brantford. This is the Stratford jail, and I was the superintendent of that facility for a couple of years. Most people may not have seen it, but if you go out of Stratford towards Goderich, and just when you get to that corner and the courthouse is in front of you, rather than turning towards Goderich, if you go up behind the courthouse, that's where the Stratford jail is located. Interesting facility's been there for a number of years, but is very old. The warden, at that time they called them the governor. We now call them superintendents. Used to live upstairs. Facility is so old that there are not washrooms in the cells. Then each range has a washroom at the end of it. So on night shift, when someone has to go to the washroom inside one of the ranges, the correctional officer can release electronically their door cell. They go to the washroom and they come back, and it's incumbent upon the inmate to close the door of their cell. Obviously, if they aren't cooperative in the future, they don't get out to go to the washroom very quickly in the evenings. This is the Hamilton Wentworth Detention Center on Barton Street. It replaced the notorious old Barton Street Jail. A lot of mafia have done time in the Barton Street Jail, and there are on occasion people connected to organized crime in the Hamilton Wentworth Detention Center to this day. And I was the deputy superintendent there for a number of years. Very, very tough institution. A lot of hardcore inmates. One riot we had there was the ringleader was a hitman for the Aryan nations. This is the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center, quite notorious recently because of murders and serious assaults. I will comment on that later. I was the superintendent there for a couple of years prior to most of those problems. And the problem there is predominantly due to overcrowding, as I will show you lately, in the future, sorry. You'll see that cells that were designed for one person frequently have 3 people living in them. This is the Maplehurst Correctional Complex. You can see the 401 at the top of the screen. This is in Milton. And the actual living areas are those octagonal pie-shaped buildings to the right. If anyone were remanded in custody or serving a short sentence in the Waterloo Region, that's where they would most likely end up. That's because of the closure of places like the Kitchener Jail and the jail that was once on Hespeler Road. There's a number of jails have been closed, and the Maplehurst Correctional Complex serves the region of Waterloo plus a lot more. This is a picture of what it's like inside Maplehurst. You can see that the tables are fixed and that there are fixed seats around the area. This is done for security reasons to stop people from throwing chairs, etc. This is another picture, and you can see that from the outside looking through this window, which is plexiglass, by the way, you can see all the cells, the cell doors. You can't see in them, but you can see a pretty good view of what is going on in the institution, in that what we call living unit range, or whatever you want to call it. There are blind spots, of course, behind the stairs, and the area where people are most vulnerable is in the shower area. Here's a typical cell, and it was designed to have one person in it. But as you can see, there has been a bunk added, and that's quite common within detention centers within Ontario. The toilet and the sink are to the left out of screen. You can see that there are coat hooks up there that are designed so that if any kind of extra weight is hooked on them, they'll fall down. This is actually a fairly typical layout to a cell. If someone gets sentenced to longer than 2 years, they go to a Canadian penitentiary. This is a picture at the bottom of the screen of the Kingston Penitentiary that was completed in 1835. It was designed on principles of morality, has moral architecture, and it really is designed for order and morality. At the time it was designed, there was a number of competing models in the US, predominantly in New York State and Pennsylvania. The model that was chosen by the government of the day was the Auburn model, and it was designed with strict silence, hard labor, and a very strong emphasis on religion. In fact, the only books that were allowed in there was the Bible, and any actually rehabilitation as far as reading was done reading the Bible. It kept housed all males, and when it initially opened was before the Juvenile Delinquency Act, and there was children as young as 12 in that facility. Shortly thereafter, the Guelph Correctional Center opened. At that time, it was called the Guelph Reformatory, and that opened in 1911. I'll return to pictures of what it's like in Guelph near the end of my presentation. Institutions generally, and I'm going to say this internationally, are divided into 3 different classifications: minimum security, medium security, and maximum security. Minimum being the lowest level of security, obviously, where there's no perimeter fence, unrestricted inmate movement, except they may be locked in their rooms at night. I say rooms instead of cells. Ontario currently does not have any minimum security facilities. The last ones were adult training centers, one which would have been on the corner of McLaughlin Road and Queen Street in Brampton. There was other ones in Hagersville and in Birch, which is south of Brantford. The Federal Correctional Service has minimum security facilities, one near Kingston and another one up near Bracebridge. Medium security institutions are generally far more common, and were very common throughout Ontario and Canada generally, but have been phased out over time in favor of more maximum security institutions. Medium security institutions have a high perimeter security fence and have more controlled inmate movement. Maximum security facilities have that perimeter fence, but far more controlled movement, far more security features. Facilities such as Maplehurst, while they have internally medium security units, are predominantly maximum security, as is places like Elgin, Middlesex, and Hamilton Wentworth Detention Center. Maximum security institutions provincially do not have firearms. We didn't believe and still don't believe, I say we because of my time working within the Ontario system. The idea was not to have firearms because people could be overpowered, and you do not want to have inmates with guns. Federally, although there are guns, they are kept to the perimeter. There is razor wire fences and motion detectors and guns on the walls. The razor wire is just as it sounds. If you touch it, you bleed. It is really nasty stuff. It was actually designed by the Israeli army to stop troop movements and attacks. And the way most of the maximum security facilities are set up are with 2 outside fences, both with razor wire, with a space between the fences where motion detectors can determine anyone who gets over the first fence before they can start climbing the second. If they continue to go, there are people with guns on the towers, and they are instructed to shoot to kill. The usual protocol is they'll fire a warning shot into the air and yell, and if the person keeps going, they are required to shoot them. As I say, provincially, places like Maplehurst do not have guns, and it's designed with the physical security such that they're not believed to be necessary. There are basically 2 types of security: that static security, which I've been describing, and also dynamic security, which is ongoing meaningful interaction between staff and inmates. I was a strong advocate when I was in the service of dynamic security. I found that it not only allowed us to keep the individuals in, but it allowed us to know what was going on. It greatly increased the safety of my staff and the inmates within the facility. The problem is, for budgetary reasons, we have cut back the number of staff in the designs and relied more on static security. That in turn ends up with you not having the type of control within the institution, while at the same time not allowing anyone to escape. There are a lot of challenges in running correctional institutions, and I'll speak to that for a few minutes. The correctional institutions, and that is kind of an overarching term to describe jails, detention centers, prisons. They're highly structured environments meant to control the movements of the inmate 24 hours a day. And your security is increased by perimeter security, things like motion detectors, guns in the federal institutions, razor wire, and that actually can become somewhat difficult for inmates to accept, especially newcomers, to look around and see that they are so controlled in such a difficult environment. Generally speaking, the vast majority of staff are very humane, but just being within that facility is very difficult. Just a comment about that razor wire I mentioned. We did have some razor wire at Guelph Correctional Center and the admission discharge area. And when my staff were putting it up, they looked like they were out of some old Renaissance movie where they were wearing chainmail in order to protect their whole body, because it was such a dangerous thing to use. If you look and see the razor wire, sometimes you can see it in the US as you're driving along I-75. There's some institutions in the north, and you can see it looks like the razor wire is kind of sloppy and just laid there. And that's because it's designed so if anyone tries to get over it, it collapses on them. Very, very dangerous stuff. You wonder why institutions have the atmosphere that they do today, and it's because there's been a lot of dumping on the criminal justice system in Canada, and I'm going to speak specifically to Ontario. But there's been a lot of downloading because of various decisions. During the 1970s and early 80s, there was a decision that our psychiatric institutions were very inhumane, and we should be trying to get people with mental illness back into the community. There was a decision to close our psychiatric institutions and to move them back to the community with appropriate support in the community. We did close them. There was a lot of psychiatric facilities throughout central and southern Ontario, but the promised supports did not always happen. So we ended up with these people being downloaded into the criminal justice system. So you now have police dealing with mentally ill, spending time, for instance, in the admissions areas to hospitals, and also because they have to be sometime taken off the street if there are nowhere else to place them, and they end up going into detention centers and jails. These facilities were not designed to house the mentally ill, and the staff are not trained by and large to deal with the mentally ill. But it is a reality that the detention centers, especially in jails, face today. There's some other issues. As a population ages, so do inmates. And I'm going to speak specifically about males now, and I'm going to talk about females in a minute. We have senior inmates with a growing number of offenders over 50. And to be over 50 in a correctional facility usually means you've had quite a adventurous, let's say it that way, life, often very colorful, and it's not unusual to see somebody in their early 50s look like they're in their late 60s as far as their appearance. They've had some pretty rough life, some of these folks. They often have chronic diseases, disabilities, and you end up dealing with things. I know that when I was in Alberta, we had an individual with a cane who needed the cane to get around. But unfortunately, he also had a temper and what is known to hit inmates and staff with the cane when he lost his temper. I would take the cane away from him when something like that happened, and he would promise to be good. I'd give him back his cane, and he would forget and hit somebody again. So it was kind of a cycle. Sometimes the senior inmates are looked upon with respect. Sometimes they are considered humorous by the younger inmates, but often they are just victimized as easy targets. So that causes tensions within the institutions. As I mentioned, people with mental illness are growing within correctional facilities, and in fact, prisons and detention centers are the new asylums. And if they're in a detention center especially, they're in a prison, they sometimes are there long enough to get some treatment, but by and large, because of the rather minor crimes the mentally ill often commit, they end up in a detention center where there are inadequate resources and insufficient time for treatment. Another unfortunate issue that is dealt with within correctional facilities across the board are individuals with fetal alcohol syndrome. As most people realize, fetal alcohol syndrome results from when the mother is drinking, often excessively, while carrying the baby, and the resulting children end up often with fetal alcohol syndrome. These individuals are very impulsive, often violent and aggressive. They don't seem to think out the consequences of their actions. They usually have learning disabilities and are hard to educate. In fact, because of their acting out, they get in trouble generally, and there are 10 times higher prevalence of individuals with fetal alcohol syndrome in correctional facilities than in the population at large. There are many other problems within correctional facilities, and overcrowding is by far one of the biggest issues. Cells that were designed for one prisoner often have that additional bunk added, as shown in the earlier picture, and it's not uncommon. Unfortunately, it's actually becoming fairly common to have a mattress thrown on the floor and an individual sleeping on that mattress. So you have a cell designed for one, housing 3 people. Hopefully they get along, not always. I know that when I was in Hamilton, we had an individual that who was thought to be fairly more likely to be victimized, ended up having a severe mental issue and ended up killing his cellmate. Problem with overcrowding is that correctional facilities, specifically detention centers and jails, can't turn prisoners away. It's because you have a population capacity such as Hamilton of about 560 individuals, or Elgin, Middlesex has a capacity of about 450. But if there are people remanded in custody and awaiting trial, you can't turn them away. Sometimes you can send them to another institution temporarily and bring them back when their court cases due, but often that place is overcrowded and there's just no place to put them, because so you end up having cells that were designed for 1 with 3 in it. Also, because of issues such as mental illness, you have an issues of solitary confinement. That is a popular topic among some individuals trying to stop solitary confinement. As a former superintendent and the chief executive officer of a number of these facilities, I must say we hated using solitary confinement unless it was absolutely necessary, but often it was the only thing we could do. When you have an individual who is mentally ill sent to a facility, often they don't fit in with the others. You put them in with other inmates, they can either attack them or they can be the source of bullying and end up being injured. One of the key mandates of correctional facilities and the superintendent is to safeguard the individuals inside. So you end up with taking an individual and housing them in solitary because of lack of other options. I'm just going to have a drink of water here in a sec. There has been a change of the population. When I first started working in correctional facilities, it was quite common. The usual population was 60% of the individuals were remanded. 60% of the individuals were sentenced and 40% remanded. And over the time, that has gradually switched to 60% remand and 40% sentenced. And now it's to the point, and the latest statistics I've seen is, and vary depending upon where you look, somewhere between 70% and in some cases 80% remanded and 20% sentenced. There's also been a change in inmate culture over time. The individuals that used to be in facilities, they were often acculturated and quite comfortable and got along within the correctional facilities. But there has been changes. For instance, at Guelph Correctional Center, you would see different motorcycle gangs in the weight room working out together. They'd be on a living unit together and get along. But over time, as the motorcycle gangs have got tougher in our population at large and more vicious to each other, inmates who are in the motorcycle gangs, just it's too dangerous to keep them together. In fact, the classification officer who determines where people are going to live end up determining which motorcycle gang, if they are a member of a gang, that a person belongs to, and try to keep them apart. This was especially prevalent when I was at Elgin Middlesex Detention Center, and time proved us right because over time, some of our discharged inmates ended up killing each other in a incident that took place west of London. Now, I'm certainly very happy that I'm not running a correctional facility today. COVID-19 what makes those places very, very tense. Just like the housing within a long-term care home or on a cruise ship, people are locked in a correctional facility with people coming, the staff coming in and out, and it could make that place very tense and volatile. Fortunately, we have not had any incidents in Ontario or in Canada other than the issue and mission of outbreaks. We haven't had a reaction from the inmates, fortunately. Majority of the offenders in correctional facilities are male, but female offenders are a separate group that have similar issues, but are have their own unique issues as well. There is an increasing group of older inmates within female offenders, just as the males and the population at large have got older. There is more women over 50, and there has been generally an increase in the number of individuals housed in female correctional facilities, an increase of 40% in the last few years. There has been, they're convicted of more violent crimes. 1 in 10 are gang affiliated, and about a quarter of them are on drug charges. Initially, it used to be female offenders were mules, people who were used by men. And if you talk to the Elizabeth Fry Society, they would say that's almost always the case. But it used to be that most female offenders who were in drug charges were carrying drugs, but now they are becoming more involved with the higher levels within gangs and higher levels of decision making within crime. Almost all female offenders have been victimized physically or sexually in the past. I know from talking to many of them that they have had some often very horrible experiences, but that's not that any, maybe worse for females, but there is a lot of victimization amongst in their past for male offenders as well. Many offenders have previous psychiatric issues, and some have present psychiatric issues. As the population ages, they have greater physical and mental health needs as well. I'm going to comment a little bit about what we have on Homer Watson Boulevard, our prison for women. That arose out of an incident in 1994 at the Kingston Prison for Women, when that institution basically had a series of disturbances. Colloquially, we would use the term riot, but a riot is not called unless there is the Riot Act read legally. So within correctional facilities, the term is a disturbance. The Kingston Prison for Women had a number of events and basically lost control of it by the staff within the prison for women. And they brought in what is called an ICIT team, ICIT, Institution Crisis Intervention Team, to regain control. There are like a SWAT team you see on television, but without firearms. When you have an ICIT team come in, you often have a camera along with the team so that people can't be accused of using excessive force or inappropriate actions when controlling the individuals. In this case, the video that was taken at the time got out to the public, and people were aghast at the amount of force that was used to control the women. The result was a very investigation, a commission that was run by Louise Arbour, and a result was the Arbour report, which recommended the closure of the prison for women. The conditions there were very, very poor. And what resulted was the construction of 5 prisons across Canada. one of which was the Grand Valley Institution for Women on Homer Watson Boulevard in Kitchener. Interesting aside, I was the only man who was interviewed in Canada for this prison for any one of the prison for women, and was interviewed in Ottawa. I did not end up getting one of those positions, and shortly thereafter we got a more responsible position within the Ontario system. The inside of Grand Valley is quite different than the pictures I showed you of the cells and the ranges within places like Maplehurst. This is a housing setup within Grand Valley, and there are a series of them, some of which have more physical security and more rigid rules than others, but they are actually fairly humane looking facilities. In fact, there is, of course, a strong perimeter security system. It costs a lot of money to house a person in a correctional facility. These prices these numbers are based on federal institutions from 2016, 2017. And you'll see each male that is housed in a minimum security institution is over $131,000. Medium security facilities cost over $100,000 per inmate. Maximum security, $175,000, and women, $259,000 per person per year. So sending someone to a prison and even a detention center as well is actually quite costly to the Canadian taxpayer. I'll talk a bit about budget problems in a few minutes, but just looking at those figures, you can see that it shouldn't be just from a purely economic perspective, sending someone to a prison should not be a very quick decision. We call similar cost for the detention centers. The predominant cost is in staffing, and that's why facilities have cut back on the dynamic security and the relationship security to more static. And you'll see that the women costs are much higher. That's for two reasons. One, economies of scale. The larger facilities for males often because of the static security cost less. There are more men in there. The women facilities such as Grand Valley do not have near as many, so the economies of scale cost more. Plus, the women tend to get a lot more programming. What's it like inside these facilities as far as doing time? Well, the person that deals with most inmates on a day-to-day basis are correctional officers. They have both legal and moral authority. They enforce the rules, and they are the people that deal with inmates on a day-to-day basis. Although there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of discretion on behalf of the correctional officers. Hiring a correctional officer is fairly complex, and at one time it was that you just hire a big tough guy who was quite capable of enforcing the rules. Now you are trying to select people who have good decision making and who are quite capable of being firm but also very fair. The relationships with the inmates is very important. You are always trying to determine what's an appropriate decision within the rules. Inmates are always testing correctional officers reading their cues, but in turn, the correctional officers are trying to read the inmates. To this day, it's not uncommon for me to be looking at people interacting in a distance and try to figure out what's going on. It becomes to quite a habit of trying to determine what's going on from a distance. Correctional officers often have a funny relationship with administration. Although most administration, such as myself, had worked their way up through the system and knew what it was like to work within correctional facilities, correctional officers often think that administration loses their sensitivity for what it's like to be inside with the inmates. In fact, the administration often are dealing with other sets of problems. There are also often conflicts between treatment staff and correctional officers. By treatment staff, I mean that in some facilities, there are social workers and psychologists working with the inmates, trying to quote unquote rehabilitate them or help them rehabilitate themselves. And depending upon the individual, some correctional officers see them as being soft on the inmates and that they are gullible and can be manipulated. As a result, sometimes there's tension. So there's different culture within the correctional facilities. There's obviously varying inmate cultures and one overarching inmate culture. There's the correctional officers, there's administration, and the treatment staff. In some facilities, such as Brampton's Ontario Correctional Institution, another institution on McLaughlin Road, the correctional officers are very involved with the treatment processes. And they're working with individuals who have elected to serve their sentence. Often they're up to about 2 years in there, and they're working on a variety of problems, usually to deal with addictions and sexual aggression within that particular institution. And there are also some other institutions, such as an institution in Brockville and another one in the north, that deal with specific types of mental health issues. And there, the correctional officers have the additional function of working with the inmates. My job near the end of my career was as a superintendent. The term superintendent is used within Ontario in some jurisdictions. Basically, you're the chief executive officer responsible for the overall institution. The federal institution would call that position a warden. In Alberta, they were called directors. But overall, that position is responsible for the institution. There's often conflicts between your job, you have the perimeter security, making sure people don't get out, but you're also responsible for safeguarding prisoners. And you're also responsible for making sure your staff are safe. But it has to be done within budget. In fact, one of the criticisms I often was given by senior staff was that my budget very seldom balanced. I usually overspent in the interest of safeguarding prisoners and staff, but there was always that conflict to try to do more and more with less. Quite understandable in a way. We have governments that are managing correctional facilities, both federally and provincially. And I'll maybe talk more about the provincial experience right now and mention that the government has its priorities. The voter, the taxpayer, would like to see government spend priorities on health, education, universities, etc., and don't see the justification for spending a great deal of money on correctional facilities. as long as they're locked up and kept off the street. That's the main job. But unfortunately, what we're doing is often sending people out that are certainly no better than when they went in, unless we can do some treatment programs. Treatment programs are possible. We did some that had significant impact on individuals and their thinking processes at the Guelph Correctional Center. And I was able to follow them for a number of individuals where we taught a cognitive problem solving program too. And I was able to follow them for a few years, and their recidivism rate, i.e. their return to jail rate, was significantly lower than individuals that didn't get that program. So who are these fellows that are inside? Well, as I say fellows, because predominantly they are male, they are young, they often have poor abilities to function in society at so large. They often have unstable backgrounds. They don't have a great deal of money. Minority people are vastly overrepresented in prisons, and I mean people of color, and particularly in Canada, we're talking Indigenous people. Indigenous people are greatly overrepresented both in detention centers, jails, and in prisons. These people often have very low skill levels, low education, and when they return to the street, they're usually underhoused. Within that, those individuals live within an inmate social system where there is an inmate subculture, rules of behavior that are established by the staff, but also over time, a subculture results where they have rules that are, of course, unwritten about how inmates get along. Individuals often become so used to the system where they become prisonized or institutionalized. They're told when to go to bed, when to get up in the morning, when to eat, and they become so structured that they often have trouble readjusting to the community. So one group of people that is often not thought about are the families of the inmates. When someone goes to jail, and the term jail, by the way, is overarching, prison, detention center. When they go to jail, they go, but often their family is looked down upon. They become isolated, stigmatized, and it's particularly difficult on the children. They often feel trauma, missing usually their daddy, and result with academic and behavioral problems. As far as running the correctional facility, it's important to have family visits because they reduce inmate misconduct, and it's important to try to keep those families together because we know that individuals who leave correctional facilities and have family support are far less likely to return. People who are involved in crime often come from quite a unique background, and in order to classify them and to develop rehabilitative programs, we need to consider a number of factors. Often they have lack of attachments. A lot of them are loners. They usually have had school or employment problems. Their time when they're not working is usually not very productive. Often, rather than being a member of a team or a club, individuals who eventually become inmates usually will spend their time drinking, often in bars. They associate with antisocial peers. Their attitudes towards society are usually negative. They can often have an actual full-blown antisocial personality disorder. Many have substance abuse problems, and they have a lengthy history of involvement of crime and antisocial behavior. This is a chart made out of Federal Institution in Saskatchewan, where it shows that of the inmates in that facility, it was believed that 92% of them had substance abuse problems, and these other issues all to a lesser degree, problems with social interactions, attitudes, employment problems, functioning in the community, and family relationships all become difficulties that individuals will have to overcome in the institutions or in the community when they return. Inmates become classified in order to determine where they're going to live, but they also, depending upon the facility that do have programs, you have to try to figure out where they're going to go and what kind of programming they're going to have. Particularly in federal institutions where they're there longer, you have a correctional plan. And in some cases, institutions like the Ontario Correctional Institution or the Brockville facility, you actually develop a plan for treatment. Unfortunately, treatment ends up often being a low priority, again, for budgeting and overcrowding reasons. So it is often has limited availability, and many leave prison without getting any opportunities for rehabilitative programming. When you are able to do any kind of programming, you look at two major factors. Those are static and dynamic factors that affect the individual's risk or returning to the community. Static factors are things that you can't change. Their criminal history, their prior convictions, their past performance when they're released. Where dynamic factors are also called needs. They are things that can be changed, increasing the person's level of education, develop employment skills, reducing their addictions, and improving their cognitive thinking ability. As I mentioned, in Guelph, we developed a program for cognitive problem solving and helping people deal with their problems in a more pro-social manner. In fact, the Ontario system uses a level of service inventory. It's called the Level of Service Inventory Ontario Revision, the LSIOR. And what that is operationalizing this risk need principles along with responsivity. And that is modifying the program to meet the abilities and needs of the individual offender. For instance, if someone was not functioning highly intellectually, you would not want to explain anything too complex to them. You have to do your design of your program to meet their needs within that additional risk need principles. This LSIOR was developed at the University of Ottawa in their criminology department, which is very psychologically oriented. And in that instrument, the LSIOR has been so successful across Canada, is now used internationally, is used in different facilities in the US and different states. And it actually, some facilities in China even use the LSIOR. These principles of effective treatment are based on looking at these dynamic risk factors, the needs and what we can change. They have to be monitored and evaluated, and you need well-educated, dedicated staff based on a system that has been empirically supported and determined to be effective. In the last few minutes of my presentation today, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. And those of you who may have been in Guelph driving out Highway 7 towards Acton may have seen this. This is outside Guelph Correctional Centre. As mentioned, this facility actually opened in 1911, and it was built by the inmates. And if you go past there, you'll see bridges, walkways, streams with a lot of stonework built by the inmates. The facility itself no longer is functioning. It's sitting there alone. In fact, when I was at Conestoga College, there was discussion about buying it. I told the president, be careful that you're going to have trouble taking it down to do anything, because it's so heavily built with stone walls. In fact, one day we were trying to put electrical wiring through, and it took us more than one day to drill one simple hole through a wall using diamond drill bits to do some wiring. So it would require a great deal of explosives or some other way of taking that building down. It would most likely be cost prohibitive. That's the outside of the regular part of the Guelph Correctional Center, and that is outside of the what is called GATU, the Guelph Assessment Treatment Unit. There were 100 inmates in that side, and they were people with mental illnesses. And the other side, we had 600. This is a typical cell at Guelph. There was dormitories in cells, and this particular cell, it looks very similar to the cell I showed earlier, with bunks, a combined sink and toilet. That mirror is stainless steel. Main difference is those are bars, and in the new facilities there are more walls. This is where the inmates used to eat at Guelph Correctional Center, rather than eating on the units like they do today. In fact, they eat in their cells for security purposes. And Guelph, they used to eat in shifts within the dining hall. And if you look to the upper left, there is a slot in the wall there. If we thought there was going to be problems, we could staff a correctional officer behind that window who could shoot gas into the unit, to the dining hall area, to control the inmates. Fortunately, in the 5 years that I was there, we never had to use it. The interesting thing about this cell range is that those doors slide, and when the new doors pull out, they're more difficult. They open out, but you can be hit by a door in a new facility. These doors slid back and forth, and were not only very secure, but they were safer. This picture is outside, looking into an exercise yard, where in that unit across the top 2 floors is where the 1989 riot occurred, disturbance we called them, and where 50 inmates on each of those 2 floors, so a total of 100 inmates, were involved in a disturbance. It cost over $1 million worth of damage. And the disturbance was caused over the government's increase in the price of tobacco. So today I've covered a bit of what correctional institutions are like. They're total institutions. Talked a little bit about the relationship between inmates and staff. Hopefully given you a bit of an introduction to some of the challenges, including the growth of remand, those special population, gangs, overcrowding. I mentioned the important role that correctional officers play, and talk a little bit about the classification system in correctional institutions. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and found it informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for your lecture. Wayne has provided some additional materials you may wish to review following this lecture to further your learning. These materials have been provided on the course webpage. We know that learning has and always will be a social activity, so we encourage you to share this lecture with friends and family to discuss what you have learned today. If you'd like to learn more about the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning, please visit wlu.ca/LALL.